Chapter 1 The Cradle of the North. Welcome back to another ambient deep dive. Before we descend into the dark history of the Leningrad siege, I want to take a moment to ask you, where are you tuning in from tonight? Whether you are listening to this while driving through the rain, working the night shift, or sitting safe in the comfort of your own home, let me know in the comments below. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy these long-form investigations into the strange and the terrifying, please make sure you are subscribed. We are building a community here that appreciates the darker side of history, and I would love for you to be a part of it. Now, take a deep breath, settle in, and let us go back to the summer of 1941. History has a way of hiding the scale of human suffering behind dates and numbers, but if you look closely at the map of the Soviet Union in the early 1940s, there is a city that stands as a monument to both the highest peaks of human culture and the lowest depths of human agony. This was Leningrad. Today, we know it as St. Petersburg, a city of canals, gold-leafed cathedrals, and aristocratic elegance. It was the Venice of the North, the crown jewel of the Tsars, and the intellectual heartbeat of the Russian soul. But in June of 1941, this city of 3 million people was about to be transformed into a sarcophagus. To understand the tragedy of Leningrad, you must first see the city as it was before the light went out. Imagine the white nights of midsummer. Because of its northern latitude, the sun barely dips below the horizon in June. The sky stays a soft, pearlescent violet for 24 hours a day. In 1941, the citizens were out in the streets, walking along the Neva River, watching the drawbridges rise like the ribs of a giant. The air was filled with the smell of blooming lilacs and the sound of distant jazz coming from open apartment windows. Students were celebrating their graduations. Families were planning trips to their country cottages or dachas. There was a sense of invincibility. After all, this was the city that had survived the Bolshevik Revolution, the city that had weathered the storms of history for over 200 years. But while the people of Leningrad were enjoying the violet twilight, a monster was breathing down their necks. Across the border, the German Wehrmacht was preparing Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of mankind. Adolf Hitler didn't just want to conquer Leningrad, he wanted to erase it. In his secret directives, he was explicit. Leningrad was to be wiped from the face of the earth. He viewed the city not as a military objective, but as a center of Judeo-Bolshevik culture that had to be liquidated. He had no interest in capturing the population. He didn't want the burden of feeding 3 million civilians. He wanted them gone. On June 22, 1941, the dream of the White Knights was shattered. The radio, broadcast that morning, changed everything. The voice of Vyacheslav Molotov crackled through the speakers in every communal kitchen and city square. Our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. But as the days turned into weeks, the reports from the front grew increasingly grim. The German Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Leib, was moving with a terrifying industrial speed. Their panzer divisions were slicing through the Baltic states like a hot knife through wax. In Leningrad, the atmosphere shifted from festive to frantic. The city began to put on its war face. The golden domes of St. Isaac's Cathedral and the spire of the Admiralty, landmarks that could be seen for miles by enemy bombers, were painted over with dull grey lead paint or covered in giant burlap sacks. The priceless treasures of the Hermitage Museum, the greatest art collection in the world, were being packed into crates by torchlight. Volunteers, many of them, teenagers and elderly women, worked in shifts to move Da Vinci's, Rembrandt's, and Titian's into the deep basement vaults or onto trains headed for the Ural Mountains. They left the empty frames hanging on the walls as a promise that the art would one day return. But you cannot move a city of 3 million people. As the German circle began to close, the reality of the situation started to seep into the bones of the citizenry. Refugees from the countryside began pouring into the city, bringing with them stories of horror, of villages burned to the ground, and Stuka dive bombers that screamed like banshees as they plummeted from the clouds. The lilacs in the parks were trampled as the city began to dig. Thousands of civilians, people who had spent their lives as librarians, factory workers, and musicians, were sent to the outskirts with shovels. They dug anti-tank ditches and trenches until their hands bled, working under the scorching July sun, trying to build a wall of earth against it, a tide of steel. By August, the German pincers were tightening. The panic was quiet, but it was absolute. The railway lines, the lifelines that brought grain from the south and coal from the east, were being cut one by one. The German high command was laughing. They believed the city would fall within weeks. They had already printed invitations to a victory banquet at the Hotel Astoria in the heart of the city. They thought they were marching toward a triumph. They didn't realize they were marching toward a 900-day nightmare. Leningrad was becoming a trap. To the west, the Gulf of Finland. To the north, the Finnish army, seeking to reclaim territory lost in the Winter War. To the south and east, the relentless march of the Wehrmacht. There was only one gap left, a narrow strip of land near the town of Schlisselburg. On September 8, 1941, the Germans captured Schlisselburg. The last road out was gone. The last rail line was severed. The circle was complete. The people of Leningrad woke up on September 9th and realized they were no longer living in a city. They were living in an island of concrete and stone, surrounded by a sea of enemies. They were cut off from the world. There were no more trains. There were no more telegrams that weren't censored. There was only the sound of the German heavy artillery beginning its long, rhythmic pounding of the suburbs. In those first few days of the blockade, there was still a sense of defiance. The people's volunteers marched to the front lines, often wearing civilian clothes and carrying rifles that were older than they were. They were sent into the meat grinder of the Pulkovo Heights, the high ground overlooking the city, to hold back the panzers at any cost. The casualties were astronomical. The fields outside the city were turned into a landscape of scorched earth and unburied bodies. But the line held. The Germans, realizing that a direct assault on a city of 3 million would be too costly in terms of blood, made a cold, calculated decision. They would not storm the gates. They would simply wait. They would let General Winter and General Hunger do the work for them. They would sit in their warm bunkers, sipping coffee, while the city inside the circle slowly turned into a graveyard. The first sign of the horror to come happened on the evening of September 8th. The Luftwaffe launched a massive incendiary raid. Their target wasn't the military barracks or the bridges. They went for the Badaev warehouses. These were the central food repositories for the entire city. From all over Leningrad, people watched as the horizon turned a hellish, pulsating orange. The smell of burning flour and melting sugar drifted over the streets, a sickeningly sweet aroma that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Thousands of tons of grain, fats, and sugar were liquidated in a single night. The melted sugar ran into the basement soil, cooling into a blackened, gritty sludge. As the sun went, down on that first day of the official siege, the temperature began to drop. The long, warm days of the white nights were over. The autumn chill was moving in, and with it, the realization that the pantry was empty. The city of the Tsars, the cradle of the revolution, was now a cage, and the 900 days of the living dead had just begun. This was the end of the world as they knew it. The schools were closing. The streetcars were beginning to stall as the power grid flickered. In the communal apartments, neighbors looked at each other with a new sharp hunger in their eyes. The beauty of the Neva, the gold of the spires, the elegance of the canals, it all meant nothing now. The only thing that mattered was the weight of a piece of bread and the warmth of a fire. The cradle of the north had become a coffin, and the lid was being nailed shut. Join me in the next chapter as we witness the tightening of the noose. We will see the birth of the siege bread, the first taste of starvation that would define a generation, and the moment the music of the city was replaced by the terrifying, rhythmic ticking of the metronome. Chapter 2. The Steel Noose. The transition from a state of war to a state of siege is not a sudden cliff. It is a slow, agonizing slide into a vacuum. By mid-September 1941, the citizens of Leningrad began to realize that the front was no longer a distant place where brothers and sons were sent to fight. The front was now at the end of their street. The geography of their lives had shrunk from a vast empire to a single suffocating circle of iron and fire. To the German High Command, this was a matter of mathematics and logistics. To the people inside, it was the beginning of the end of the world. As the German Army Group North solidified its positions, the steel noose became a physical reality. The encirclement was so tight that from the upper floors of the taller buildings in the southern districts, people could actually see the sunlight glinting off the windshields of German trucks. They could see the smoke from German field kitchens. The enemy was so close they could almost hear the commands being shouted in a language that had once been the tongue of philosophers and poets, but was now the language of their executioners. The German strategy was cold, clinical, and devoid of the honourable combat found in the history books. Field Marshal von Lieb's orders were clear. A surrender of Leningrad is not to be accepted, even if offered by the enemy. The Germans didn't want the city's buildings, and they certainly didn't want its mouths to feed. They wanted the city to remain a closed system, a biological experiment in how long a human population could endure before it simply ceased to exist. They fortified their lines not to push in, but to make sure nothing could get out. Inside the noose, the first thing to die was the sense of time. When a city is cut off, the rhythm of normal life, the arrival of the morning mail, the fresh bread at the bakery, the morning commute, evaporates. In its place came the siege rhythm. This was dictated by the German artillery schedule. The shelling was methodical. It wasn't a chaotic barrage. It was an industrial process. Every day, at the same hours, the heavy guns would begin to bark from the heights of Pulkovo and the forests of Tosno. The targets were chosen to maximize psychological trauma. They shelled the hospitals. They shelled the schools. They shelled the tram stops during rush hour when the most people would be gathered. The sound of the incoming shells, a rising predatory whistle followed by a bone-shaking thud, became the new soundtrack of the city. People learned to judge the caliber of the gun by the vibration in their feet. They learned which side of the street was safer based on the trajectory of the German batteries. To this day, on the Nevsky Prospect, there are signs preserved from the war that read, "Citizens." During shelling, this side of the street is the most dangerous. But as terrifying as the steel rain was, a much quieter and more lethal enemy was moving through the streets, the realization of the food situation. When the Badaev warehouses burned, the city lost its safety net. The remaining stockpiles were scattered in smaller depots, but they were woefully inadequate for a population of 3 million. The Soviet authorities, led by the ruthless Andrei Zhdanov, began a series of frantic, almost panicked recalculations. The bread rations, which had already been reduced in July and August, were slashed again, and then again. By the end of September, the daily ration for a manual worker was 600 grams. Not much, but enough to survive. For a child or a non-working dependent, it was 300 grams. But these numbers were a lie, a downward spiral that everyone could see. The quality of the bread was changing too. As the real flour ran out, the bakers began to experiment with additives. They added bran. They added fodder grain meant for horses. Eventually, they would add things that weren't food at all. The steel noose also cut off the city's heat and light. Leningrad's power plants relied on coal and oil brought in by rail. With the tracks cut, the coal piles shrank until they were nothing but dust. One by one, the lights in the apartments flickered and died. The city entered a state of permanent twilight. Without electricity, the water pumps failed. The pipes, no longer protected by the heat of the buildings, began to freeze and burst as the autumn turned toward a prematurely bitter winter. This was the moment when the ambient horror of the siege truly took hold. Imagine a city of millions, once vibrant and loud, falling into a deep, unnatural silence. The trams stopped running, left like ghost ships in the middle of the snow-covered tracks. The only sounds were the wind howling between the stone buildings, the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the metronome over the radio, and the crunch of boots on ice. The metronome is a detail that haunts every survivor's diary. Because the radio was the only way for the government to communicate with the people, it was kept on 24 hours a day. But there wasn't enough content to fill the airwaves, and they needed a way to signal that the station was still live and the city hadn't fallen. So they broadcast the sound of a metronome, 60 beats per minute, tick, tick, tick. It was the pulse of Leningrad. If it sped up, it was a warning of an air raid. If it was slow, it meant the city was simply waiting. People would sit in their dark, freezing rooms, huddled under layers of coats, just listening to that heartbeat. It was a reminder that they weren't alone in the dark, but it was also a countdown. In this period of the noose, the social fabric began to fray in subtle, terrifying ways. The black market emerged almost overnight. Gold watches, family heirlooms, and diamond rings were traded for a single loaf of bread or a tin of meat. The value of currency vanished. Rubles were just paper. The only true currency was calories. And then there was the bureaucracy of death. The Soviet system, even in the midst of a cataclysm, remained obsessed with paperwork. To get your bread, you needed a ration card. Losing that card was the equivalent of a death sentence. There were no replacements. In the queues that stretched for blocks in the freezing rain, people clutched their cards with a desperate white-knuckled grip. To have your card stolen was to be erased. You would see people who had been robbed standing outside the bakeries, not crying, but simply staring at the door with a hollow, vacant look, knowing that they had just become a living corpse. The Germans, meanwhile, were tightening the external noose. They captured the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, leaving only a tiny sliver of the northern coast in Russian hands. They were so confident that the city would surrender that they began to move some of their panzer divisions away to the Moscow front, leaving the infantry and the artillery to finish the job. They believed that by November, the stinking city of the Bolsheviks would be a mass grave. Inside the city, the military commanders were desperate. General Georgy Zhukov, the man who would later become the hero of Berlin, was sent to Leningrad with orders from Stalin to hold the city at any cost. Zhukov was a man of iron and blood. He instituted a no-retreat policy that was enforced by execution. Any soldier or civilian found to be spreading panic or retreating from their post was shot on the spot. The city was trapped between the German noose on the outside and the Soviet iron fist on the inside. There was no way out and no way back. As October arrived, the first snow began to fall. It wasn't the soft, romantic snow of a Russian novel. It was a wet, heavy shroud that covered the piles of uncollected trash and the craters in the streets. The temperature began to drop below freezing and stayed there. The Neva River began to clog with sludge ice, thick, grey chunks of frozen water that looked like grinding teeth. The steel noose was now a frozen noose. The people of Leningrad looked at their dwindling piles of wood, their shrinking pieces of bread, and their empty water buckets. They looked at the dark, silent horizon where the German guns waited. They realized that the week-long siege they had expected was a fantasy. They were entering a tunnel of darkness with no light at the end. The transition was complete. The city of culture was gone. The city of the living dead was being born. The residents began to refer to themselves not as citizens, but as blockaded ones. It was a new identity, one forged in the cold, defined by hunger, and bound by the iron circle of the Wehrmacht. Join me in the next chapter as the hunger moves from a dull ache to a consuming fire. We will witness the destruction of the city's last hope for food, and we will see how the people of Leningrad began to eat the sweet earth in a desperate attempt to stay alive for one more day. Chapter 3. The Sweet Earth. There is a specific smell associated with the end of a civilization. It isn't always the smell of decay or smoke. Sometimes it is the smell of something misplaced. In the second week of September 1941, that smell was sugar. On the evening of September 8th, the Luftwaffe had successfully targeted the Badaev warehouses, the central nervous system of Leningrad's food supply. Millions of pounds of flour, fats, and meat were incinerated in a fire so hot it could be felt blocks away. But it was the sugar that left the most lasting mark on the city's memory. Thousands of tons of it melted, forming rivers of white and brown liquid that hissed as they poured into the cold basement dirt. When the fires were finally extinguished, a strange, sickeningly sweet aroma hung over the southern districts of the city. It was an olfactory taunt. The people of Leningrad, who were already feeling the first sharp pangs of a reduced ration, stood in the streets and breathed in the scent of their own survival going up in smoke. But even in the face of such a catastrophic loss, the human instinct for life is a frantic, desperate thing. Within hours of the fires dying down, people began to congregate at the ruins of the Badaev site. They didn't come to mourn, they came to mine. The sugar had seeped into the ground, penetrating deep into the soil and the ash. The survivors, women in headscarves, elderly men and wide-eyed children, descended upon the blackened earth with spoons, knives and bare fingernails. They began to dig. They filled buckets and jars with the gritty blackened mud. Back in their cold apartments, they would boil this sweet earth in pots of water. The dirt would settle to the bottom, and the water would take on a dark, syrupy hue. This Badaev earth became a legendary, albeit tragic, luxury. It tasted of grit and soot, but it contained calories. In the early days of the siege, a jar of this blackened dirt could be traded for a winter coat or a gold watch. It was the first sign that the people of Leningrad were no longer eating food. They were eating history. They were eating the ground they stood on. The loss of the Badaev warehouses accelerated the city's descent into a nutritional abyss. The Soviet authorities, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, were forced to face a mathematical horror. They had 3 million people to feed, and they had enough grain to last perhaps 30 days. There were no reinforcements coming. There were no secret silos. The sweet earth was a temporary reprieve, a psychological bandage on a mortal wound. By October, the ambient deep dive into hunger became a study in the slow-motion collapse of the human body. Starvation is not a quick process. It is a theft. It begins by stealing your fat, then your muscle, and, finally, your mind. The citizens of Leningrad began to experience the first stage, the obsession. Every conversation, regardless of how it started, whether it was about music, politics, or the war, inevitably circled back to food. People would spend hours describing, in vivid detail, the meals they had eaten a year ago. They would recount the smell of a roasting chicken or the texture of a fresh loaf of rye bread until they were weeping from the sheer sensory memory of it. The streets began to change. The city's domestic animals, the dogs, the cats, the pet birds, disappeared first. At first it was whispered about in hushed tones, a secret shame. But soon it became an accepted reality of the siege. If a cat was seen in an alleyway, it was not a pet, it was a target. The disappearance of the animals brought a new kind of silence to the city. No barking, no mewing, just the sound of the wind. Next came the leather stage. People realized that their everyday items, belts, shoes, briefcase handles, and even the bindings of old books, were made of animal hides. They began to boil these items for hours, sometimes days, until the leather broke down into a grey, translucent jelly. It had no flavor and very little nutritional value, but it filled the stomach. It provided a temporary illusion of fullness. In the communal kitchens, you would see families sitting around a pot, watching a leather belt swirl in the boiling water, waiting for the soup to be ready. The psychological toll of this was perhaps even greater than the physical. Leningrad was a city of intellectuals, of prideful workers, of cultured elites. To be reduced to digging for sugar-soaked dirt and boiling your own shoes was a humiliation that broke the spirit before it broke the body. You could see it in the eyes of the people in the bread lines. The siege stare was beginning to settle in, a wide-eyed, vacant expression that suggested the person was looking through you at something miles away. The bread itself, the siege bread, was becoming a laboratory experiment in survival. As the stocks of rye and wheat flour vanished, the bakers were ordered to use food substitutes. These included edible cellulose, essentially treated wood pulp, cotton seeds, bran, and the dust shaken from flour sacks that had been sitting in the back of warehouses for years. The result was a heavy, moist, black brick that tasted of damp earth and sawdust. Because it was so heavy with moisture and additives, it wouldn't even burn if you threw it in a fire. It was the only thing standing between the population and total extinction. As the sweet earth was depleted and the leather was boiled away, the city's inhabitants began to look at things they had previously ignored. They looked at the wallpaper. In the older buildings of Leningrad, the wallpaper was often applied with a paste made from potato starch or animal glue. People began to peel the paper from the walls in long strips. They would soak the paper to scrape off the dried paste, which they would then cook into a thin, watery gruel. A room that once held a library or a piano was now a source of starch. The very walls of the city were being consumed. The German commanders, observing through their long-range binoculars from the heights, were pleased. They could see the lack of smoke from the city's chimneys. They could see the slowing movement of the people in the streets. They knew that the sweet earth was a finite resource. They knew that a human being can only survive so long on wood pulp and boiled belts. They were waiting for the white flag to appear over the Winter Palace. But the white flag didn't come. Instead, something far more terrifying began to happen. The hunger was beginning to peel away the layers of civilization, revealing the raw, jagged edges of the human animal. In the darkness of the unlit apartment blocks, the communal spirit of the early weeks was being replaced by the predatory suspicion. Families began to eat in secret, afraid that the smell of their leather soup would draw desperate neighbors to their door. The sweet earth had taught them that everything could be food, and as the winter of 1941 began to settle in with a bone-crushing cold, that lesson was about to be taken to its most horrific conclusion. The ground was freezing. The sugar dirt was becoming as hard as stone, requiring picks and axes to break. The water pipes had long since burst, forcing the starving population to trek down to the frozen Neva River, hacking holes in the ice to haul up buckets of grey, freezing water. This trek, the water journey, became a trial of endurance. Many would collapse on the way back, their hearts giving out from the strain. Their buckets would spill, the water freezing instantly on the pavement, and they would be left there, curled around their empty containers, as the snow began to cover them. Leningrad was no longer a city of the living. It was a city of the slowing. Every movement was calculated to save energy. People walked with a slow, shuffling gait, their heads down, their breath coming in shallow gasps of white steam. They were the shadows of the people they used to be, haunted by the memory of the sweet earth and the smell of the Badayev fires. They were entering the heart of the first winter, a winter that would see the temperature drop to 40 degrees below zero, and a winter that would ask them exactly what they were willing to do to see the sun rise one more time. Join me in the next chapter, as the silence of the city is broken by a new sound. We will explore the sound of the heartbeat, the introduction of the metronome, and the psychological warfare of the blackout, as Leningrad enters the long, dark tunnel of the first winter. Chapter 4. The Sound of the Heartbeat. As the autumn of 1941 bled into a premature and brutal November, a new physical reality settled over Leningrad. It was a darkness so absolute that it seemed to have weight. With the coal reserves gone and the power stations silenced, the city's electrical grid breathed its last. The streetlights, once the pride of the imperial capital, became useless iron stalks. The grand apartments of the aristocracy and the cramped communal flats of the workers alike were plunged into a permanent freezing twilight. In this void, the people of Leningrad lost their sight, but their hearing became preternaturally sharp, and the sound that defined this era, the sound that echoed through every dark hallway and snow-filled square, was the ticking of the metronome. To understand the atmosphere of the Leningrad blackout, you must imagine a world without a single artificial glow. There were no flashlights, batteries were non-existent. There were no candles. The wax had been eaten or used for fuel. The only light came from koptilki, tiny homemade lamps made from medicine bottles or jars filled with machine oil or grease, with a bit of rag for a wick. They produced more soot than light, coating the faces of the starving in a thin layer of black grime, making them look even more like ghosts. In this near-total darkness, the radio became the only umbilical cord connecting the individual to the collective. But the radio could not broadcast music or speeches 24 hours a day. The city was under siege, and the authorities needed to conserve what little power remained for essential transmissions. Yet, they could not leave the airwaves silent. Silence in a besieged city is a poison. It breeds rumors. It suggests that the government has fled, or that the enemy has breached the gates. They needed a signal to tell the 3 million trapped souls that Leningrad was still breathing. That signal was a simple mechanical metronome. Tick, 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 60 beats per minute. It was the rhythm of a resting heart. It was broadcast through the radio Toshka, the hardwired speakers present in almost every Soviet apartment and on street corners. For the blockaded ones, this sound became the background radiation of their existence. It was a sensory anchor. You would wake up in the middle of the night, shivering in a room that was 10 degrees below freezing, and hear that steady pulse. It told you that the station was still powered, that the technicians were still at their posts, and that the city had not yet surrendered. But the metronome was more than just a comfort. It was a survival tool. The tempo was a code. When the German radar or spotters detected incoming Luftwaffe bombers or a particularly heavy artillery barrage, the metronome would accelerate. The heartbeat of the city would double, then triple. Tick, 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 tick. This was the air raid alert. It was a sound that triggered a Pavlovian response of dread. People would scramble in the dark, grabbing their evacuation bags and their precious ration cards, and begin the long, stumbling descent down frozen stairwells to the damp, crowded cellars that served as bomb shelters. When the danger passed, the metronome would slow back down to its resting pace. That transition, the slowing of the heartbeat, was the only all-clear many people would hear for days. It was a psychological masterpiece of unintentional design. It turned the city's survival into a shared biological rhythm. Outside the apartments, the blackout created a landscape of lethal confusion. Because the trams had stopped, the tracks became tripwires hidden under the snow. The city was a graveyard of abandoned machinery. People moving through the streets at night had to wear luminous eyes, tiny badges coated in phosphorus that glowed faintly, just enough to prevent pedestrians from colliding with one another in the gloom. These tiny drifting green sparks were the only signs of life in a city that had once been the Paris of the East. The silence of the blackout was punctuated by the symphony of the siege. First, there was the wind. Leningrad is a city of water and stone, and in the winter, the Baltic winds howl through the canyons of the prospects like a screaming animal. Then, there was the sound of the burzwika. These were small portable iron stoves that people installed in their rooms, venting the smoke through holes cut directly into the walls or windows. To feed the burzwika, the people of Leningrad began to burn their lives. They burned their furniture. They burned their floorboards. They burned their libraries. There is a specific tragedy in burning a library to stay warm for an hour. People would sit in the dark, feeding the flames with the works of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin. They would look at the pages one last time before the fire consumed them, a literal incineration of the culture they were supposed to be defending. The smell of burning paper and old book bindings mingled with the scent of the machine oil lamps, creating a heavy, acrid haze that settled in the lungs of the starving. And then there was the sound of the German guns. The artillery had become so predictable that people gave the shells nicknames. The heavy 305mm shells were called the suitcases. You didn't hear the shell that hit you. You only heard the one that passed over, a sound like a freight train tearing through the sky. The blackout meant you couldn't see the muzzle flashes. You could only feel the concussions. The ground would heave, and the ice on the Neva would crack with a sound like a gunshot. The psychological warfare of the blackout was bolstered by the German leaflet war. Along with the shells, the Germans dropped millions of pieces of paper. They were designed to break the will of the people. They showed pictures of German soldiers eating hot meals, or they listed the names of Soviet commanders who had supposedly surrendered. They told the people of Leningrad that Stalin had abandoned them, that the ring of death would never break, and that their only choice was to die in the dark or walk toward the German lines with their hands up. But the metronome kept ticking. Tick, tick, tick. The Soviet authorities responded with their own psychological tactics. They installed massive loudspeakers facing the German trenches. At night, they would play recordings of the metronome, followed by a voice that spoke in German. In Leningrad, every 7 seconds, a person is dying. Every 7 seconds, a person dies. They would play the sound of a ticking clock, then a gong, then the message again. It was a reminder to the Germans that while they were the ones holding the noose, they were also tied to the corpse of the city. They were trapped in the same frozen hell, just on the other side of the wire. The sound of the heartbeat also masked the darker sounds of the city. In the absolute darkness, crime became easy and invisible. This was the era of the ration card snatchers. People would wait near the bakeries in the pre-dawn gloom, waiting for an elderly woman or a weak child to emerge with their precious 125 grams of bread. A quick blow, a shove into a snowdrift, and the bread was gone. The victim would often not even scream. They didn't have the breath for it. They would just lie there in the dark, listening to the metronome from a nearby street speaker, knowing that their life had just ended. By late November, the city had reached a state of sensory deprivation. The hunger had progressed to the point where the body begins to shut down non-essential functions. People's hearing remained sharp, but their vision blurred. Their sense of touch became a dull ache of cold. In this hollowed-out state, the metronome was no longer just a sound. It was a tether to reality. If the metronome stopped, the world ended. I remember reading a diary entry from a young girl named Elena, who lived through that first winter. She wrote, "The darkness is our home now. We sit in our coats, 3 of us on the bed, and we do not speak because speaking takes energy. We only listen. We listen to the wind, we listen to the shells, and we listen to the radio. As long as it ticks, we are still here. When it stops, we will be like the others in the hallway. We will be the silence." The sound of the heartbeat was the only thing that kept the city of the living dead from becoming a city of the simply dead. It was a mechanical promise that the machinery of the state, however broken and cruel, was still functioning. But the winter was only beginning. The temperature was continuing to plummet, and the steel noose was about to be tested by the only thing that could challenge the German blockade, the ice. Join me in the next chapter as we witness the arrival of the White Death. We will see the temperature drop to 40 degrees below zero the moment the water pipes became ice bombs, and the desperate freezing trek of the water journey that claimed more lives than the German shells. Chapter 5. The White Death. If the hunger was a slow erosion of the soul, the winter of 1941 was a sudden, violent assault on the flesh. In a normal year, a Russian winter is a thing of beauty and national pride. But 1941 was not a normal year. Meteorologists would later record it as one of the coldest winters in centuries. By late November, the temperature in Leningrad did not just drop, it plummeted, bottoming out at nearly 40 Celsius. At that temperature, physics begins to change. Metal becomes as brittle as glass. Exposed skin freezes in less than a minute. And for a city without heat, without light, and without food, the cold became a more efficient killer than the German Wehrmacht could ever hope to be. The arrival of the White Death transformed the internal landscape of every home. Because the central heating pipes had frozen and burst weeks ago, the very walls of the apartments became blocks of ice. The sweat of the stone walls, moisture from the breath of the inhabitants, froze into a thick white rime of frost. People stopped living in their rooms and began living in nests. They moved their beds into the kitchens, the smallest rooms in the house, and hung heavy blankets or even carpets over the doors and windows to trap what little body heat remained. They stayed in their coats, their hats, and their gloves 24 hours a day. They became bundles of rags, huddled together for warmth, listening to the wood of the building groan and crack as the frost expanded deep inside the masonry. The most basic necessity of life, water, became the focus of a daily life-threatening struggle. When the pumps died, the taps went dry. The only source of water was the Neva River, or the canals that crisscrossed the city. This gave birth to one of the most haunting images of the siege, the water journey. Imagine an elderly woman, her body weight reduced by 40%, her legs swollen with edema from starvation. She must walk 2 miles through the waist-deep snow, carrying 2 empty buckets. The wind on the riverbank is a razor, cutting through her layers of burlap and wool. She reaches the ice of the Neva, which is now several feet thick. There, the city authorities or the military have hacked ice holes, small, dark circles of freezing water. She must kneel on the ice, her joints screaming, and dip her buckets into the black depths. The danger was not just the cold, it was the physics of the journey back. The spilled water would instantly freeze on the path, creating a glass road of ice. If she slipped and fell, she likely wouldn't have the strength to get back up. If her bucket spilled, the water was gone, and she would have to start over, if she could. Thousands of people simply sat down on their sleds or by their buckets and closed their eyes. The White Death is a merciful killer in one regard. It induces a profound, sleepy apathy. You stop feeling the cold, you feel a strange, deceptive warmth, a desire to rest, just for a moment. But in Leningrad, a moment's rest was an eternity. By morning, these snow mounds would be just more obstacles for the next day's water carriers to shuffle past. The cold also changed the nature of death itself. In a normal world, the dead are removed, mourned, and buried. In the winter of 1941, the dead became part of the architecture. Because the ground was frozen solid, it was impossible to dig graves. The cemeteries were overflowing, with thousands of bodies piled like cordwood at the gates. In the apartment blocks, families would move their dead relatives into the cold rooms, unoccupied bedrooms, where the temperature was well below freezing. There, the bodies would stay, perfectly preserved by the frost, sometimes for months. People lived, ate their 125 grams of bread, and slept just a few feet away from their frozen loved ones. There was a macabre, ambient horror to this domestic life. A survivor named Yuri once recalled waking up in the middle of the night and seeing his grandfather sitting in the chair by the window. For a moment, he thought the old man was watching the moonlight on the snow. Then he remembered that his grandfather had died 3 days ago. The cold had simply turned the room into a morgue. This proximity to the dead stripped away the natural human fear of a corpse. The dead were just companions who no longer felt the hunger. The White Death also claimed the city's infrastructure. The few remaining trees in the parks, the ancient limes and oaks that had shaded the czars, were cut down for fuel. When the trees were gone, people turned to the wooden houses in the suburbs, dismantling them board by board. When those were gone, they burned the fences. Finally, they burned the furniture. A grand piano could keep a room above freezing for 2 days. A mahogany wardrobe might buy you 3. People made Sophie's choices with their belongings. Do we burn the dining table today, or the bookshelf? Do we burn the books of poetry, or the technical manuals? In the midst of this frozen wasteland, the German soldiers on the Ring were also suffering, but they had the luxury of supply lines. They watched the city through their periscopes, marveling at the fact that any life remained at all. They nicknamed Leningrad the frozen grave. They believed that once the spring thaw came, the city would be nothing but a mass of rotting flesh, and they could simply walk in and shovel the remains into the Neva. They did not account for the internal fire of the defenders, a fire that was fueled by a hatred as cold as the Siberian wind. The cold also brought a strange crystalline clarity to the air. On the coldest nights, the sky was filled with brilliant, uncaring stars. The German shells, when they landed, would shatter the frozen earth with a sound like 1,000 windows breaking at once. The ambient experience of Leningrad in December 1941 was one of sharp, jagged edges. Everything was hard. The bread was hard. The ground was hard. The hearts of the survivors were becoming hard. This was the peak of the dystrophy winter. The biological process of starvation was being accelerated by the cold, as the body burned through its last caloric reserves just to keep the internal organs from freezing. People were losing their hair. Their skin was turning a bruised, yellowish purple. The siege stare was now universal. In the blackout, you would only see the eyes, huge, sunken, and glowing with a desperate animal light in the flicker of the oil lamps. The White Death had turned Leningrad into a moonscape. No cars, no birds, no animals, no light. Just the endless white expanse of the snow, the black holes in the ice, and the shuffling shadows of the living dead. It was a world where the only thing that moved was the wind and the smoke from the burzwika stoves, rising like thin grey souls into the frozen sky. But as the year 1841 came to a close, and the city reached the very bottom of its endurance, a new possibility emerged from the frozen horizon. The very thing that was killing them, the ice, was about to become their only hope. The great Lake Ladoga, to the east of the city, was finally freezing solid. And on that ice, a road was being marked out. A road that would be known to the world as the Road of Life, but to those who drove it, it would be the Road of Ghosts. Join me in the next chapter as we witness the 125-gram ration, the bread of the dead, and the desperate scientific attempt to turn wood and dust into life. We will look at the chemistry of the siege and the agonizing ritual of the daily meal. Chapter 6. 125. Gramsin, the long, dark history of human endurance. There is perhaps no number more significant or more terrifying than 125. For the citizens of Leningrad in the winter of 1941, this was not just a number on a page of a ledger. It was the weight of their daily existence. It was the siege ration. On November 20th, 1941, the bread ration, the IR, for dependents, children, and office workers was slashed to its lowest point, 125 grams. To visualize this, imagine a piece of bread roughly the size of a standard deck of playing cards, but only half as thick. This was all a human being was expected to live on for 24 hours in a world where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, and the body was under constant bone-shaking stress from artillery fire. But to call it bread was a generous use of the word. As we have seen in our ambient journey so far, the steel noose had cut off the supply of real flour. The siege bread was a masterpiece of desperate chemistry and grim ingenuity. The bakers, working in freezing factories where the dough had to be mixed with water hauled from the ice-covered Neva, were forced to find fillers to make the dwindling grain last. By December, the bread was only 50% rye flour. The rest was a mixture of edible cellulose, essentially wood pulp, defatted cottonseed cake, bran, dust from the floor of the warehouses, and fines, the sweepings from the bottoms of grain ships. The resulting substance was a heavy, moist, dark grey mass. Because it was so dense with non-food additives and saturated with water to increase its weight, it felt like a cold piece of clay in the hand. It had a bitter chemical taste and a smell that many survivors described as damp earth and machine oil. It was so moisture-heavy that if you tried to squeeze it, water would seep out of the crust. Yet, to the starving, this 125-gram brick was the most precious object in the universe. It was the only barrier between the spirit and the void. The ritual of the 125 grams became a sacred, agonizing process. When you received your ration from the state bakery, you did not simply eat it. To eat it all at once was considered a form of slow suicide. It meant you would have nothing to sustain your metabolic fire for the next 23 hours and 55 minutes. Instead, the blockaded ones became experts in the art of the crumb. They would take the bread home, hide it deep within their many layers of clothing to keep it from freezing solid, and sit in their nests, by the flicker of an oil lamp. Many survivors described the ritual of the knife. They would cut the tiny brick into 3 or 4 microscopic pieces, one for the morning, one for the afternoon, and one for the night. Some would even cut these pieces into smaller cubes, placing a single cube on the tongue and letting it dissolve slowly, trying to extract every possible molecule of nutrition and flavor. They would chew each crumb dozens of times, tricking the brain into believing it was receiving a feast. The crumbs that fell onto the table were not brushed away. They were pressed onto a moistened fingertip and licked off with a fervor that bordered on the religious. The biological reality of living on 125 grams of wood bread was a slow-motion collapse of the human machine. A human body at rest in the cold needs at least 2,000 to 2,500 calories just to maintain its internal temperature. The 125-gram ration provided roughly 300 to 400 calories, most of which came from indigestible fiber. The math was simple and cruel. Every day you lived in Leningrad, you were becoming less. The body began to eat itself in a specific, predictable order. First, the subcutaneous fat vanished. Then, the muscles began to waste away, the arms and legs becoming like dry sticks. Finally, the body began to consume its own internal organs and the protein in the heart muscle. This physical erosion led to the siege stare, which we have touched on before, but there was a deeper, more ambient horror to it. Because the facial fat had vanished, the skin tightened over the skull, giving the living the appearance of ancient, yellowed parchment stretched over a bone mask. The eyes, however, seemed to grow larger. They became luminous, haunted, and fixed on a point in the distance that no one else could see. When you walked down the street in December 1941, you were walking through a gallery of skeletons. People moved with a slow, mechanical shuffle, their arms held out slightly from their sides for balance, looking like a procession of sleepwalkers. The 125 grams also created a new social hierarchy. There were those who had heavy worker cards, which granted them 250 or 375 grams. These were the elite, the factory workers making shells, and the soldiers on the front lines. Then there were the dependents, the elderly, the intellectuals, the artists. In the communal apartments, this created a heartbreaking dynamic. You would have a mother who worked in a munitions plant receiving 375 grams, and her child receiving 125. The mother would often secretly pinch off a corner of her own bread to add to her child's portion. It was a beautiful act of love, but in the cold math of the siege, it often meant that the mother died first, leaving the child alone in a freezing room with no one to fetch the water or the bread. The state bakeries themselves were temples of high tension. The queues would start in the middle of the night, long before the sun, such as it was, rose over the city. People stood in the Sartent 40 Taman circled text, "See Awostan darkness," for 6, 8, 10 hours, huddled together for warmth. The fear of the bakeries running out of bread before you reached the counter was a constant gnawing terror. When the doors finally opened, the smell of the siege bread, bitter as it was, would cause people to swoon. There were no riots. The people were too weak for riots. There was only a heavy, desperate silence, punctuated by the hiss of the sleds and the distant, rhythmic thud of German artillery. Behind the scenes, the 125 grams was the result of a desperate war of science. Soviet scientists at the Institute of Plant Industry and the Vitamin Institute were working in unheated labs, their hands blue with cold, trying to find ways to extract vitamins from pine needles and proteins, from yeast grown on wood waste. They developed a vitamin infusion made from fermented pine needles that was distributed to the population to prevent scurvy. It tasted like turpentine and caused many to gag, but it kept their teeth from falling out. There is a profound irony in the fact that these scientists, who were discovering ways to save millions, were themselves living on 125 grams. Many of them died at their microscopes, their last act being the recording of a discovery that would save someone else. As the first month of the 125-gram ration drew to a close, the death toll began to skyrocket. In October, the city recorded 6,000 deaths from starvation. In November, it rose to 11,000. In December, the number exploded to 52,000. And this was only the official count, those whose deaths were recorded. Thousands more lay in their nests, unnoticed, their 125-gram rations sitting untouched on the table beside them. The 125 grams was the threshold. It was the point where the human being was stripped of everything, identity, profession, status, and hope, leaving only the raw, pulsing urge to survive one more hour. It was the weight of the shadow that Leningrad had become. It was the bread of the dead, eaten by the living so that they might last long enough to see the ice on Lake Ladoga thicken. Because while 125 grams was the measure of their suffering, the frozen lake was the measure of their only escape. Join me in the next chapter as we leave the dark streets of the city for the wide, white expanse of Lake Ladoga. We will witness the birth of the road of life, a miracle of engineering and a corridor of ghosts, where the price of a bag of grain was often the life of a driver, lost in the black water beneath the ice. Chapter 7. The Lake of Ghosts. The survival of a city is usually a matter of roads, rails, and rivers. But by the end of November 1941, every road into Leningrad was a German trench, every rail line was a twisted wreck of steel, and the Neva river was a frozen artery of black ice. The city was a lung that had been denied air. However, to the east lay a massive, shivering expanse of water, Lake Ladoga. It is the largest lake in Europe, a freshwater sea so vast it creates its own weather, its own storms, and, in the winter of 1941, its own legend. It was here, across the treacherous shifting surface of the ice, that the Soviet High Command decided to build a miracle. They called it the Road of Life, but to the men who drove it and the families who waited on the shore, it was known by a more honest name, the Road of Ghosts. The engineering of the Road of Life was a feat born of absolute desperation. It was not a single highway, but a shifting network of tracks marked by pine branches stuck into the snow. In the beginning, the ice was too thin to support the weight of a truck. The first supply runs were made by horse-drawn sleds, the animals' ribs showing through their hide, their breath freezing into long icicles as they pulled meager sacks of flour across the 30-mile expanse. But as the temperature dropped to sac 40 circa text, see dollars, the ice thickened, reaching the critical depth of 8 inches, enough to support the Gaz AA Polutorka trucks. The ambient experience of driving the Road of Life was a descent into a sensory purgatory. Imagine being a driver, your stomach a hollow pit after months of the siege ration. You are sitting in the cab of a truck that has no heater and often no doors. The doors were removed by order of the commanders. This wasn't for ventilation, it was for survival. If the ice beneath your wheels began to crack, you had only seconds to jump. If you were trapped behind a door, the truck became your coffin as it plummeted into the 700-foot deep blackness of the lake. The soundscape of the lake was a symphony of terror. There was the constant low-frequency groaning of the ice, a sound like a giant grinding its teeth. The weight of the trucks created pressure waves under the frozen surface. If a driver went too fast, the wave would catch up to the truck and shatter the ice from beneath. If they went too slow, the weight would settle and sink. There was a specific perfect speed, a rhythm of life, that every driver had to master. Above the groaning of the ice was the scream of the wind, which swept across the flat expanse of Ladoga with nothing to break its force. It whipped the snow into whiteout conditions, where a driver could not see the hood of his own vehicle, let alone the pine branches marking the path. But the most terrifying sound was the whistle of the Stuka dive bombers. The German Luftwaffe knew exactly what the Road of Life meant. They knew that every truck that reached the western shore carried enough flour to keep 1,000 people alive for another day. From their airfields just miles away, they launched constant raids. They didn't just aim for the trucks, they aimed for the ice itself. They dropped heavy bombs to create polinias, giant holes of open water that would be camouflaged by a thin layer of new snow by the time the next convoy arrived. Driving at night offered no respite. Headlights were forbidden. They were beacons for German artillery and aircraft. The drivers steered by the faint shimmering light of the stars or the luminous eyes of the truck in front of them. When a truck hit a hole or a weak spot, there was no splash. There was only a sudden heavy thump, a sickening tilt, and then silence as the taillights vanished into the depths. The trucks that followed didn't stop. They couldn't. To stop was to sink. They simply drove around the new hole, their tires crunching on the edges of the abyss, and kept moving toward the city of the dead. For the people of Leningrad, the Lake of Ghosts was their only bridge back to the world of the living. The road of life worked in two directions. Inbound, it brought flour, meat, and fuel. Outbound, it carried the human ballast, the women, children, and elderly who were being evacuated. The evacuation was a brutal triage. Only those who could survive the journey across the ice were chosen. Mothers would wrap their children in every scrap of fabric they owned, clutching them in the back of open-top trucks as the wind threatened to freeze the tears on their cheeks. There are accounts of frozen convoys found on the ice, trucks that had run out of fuel or broken down in the middle of a blizzard. When rescuers reached them days later, they would find everyone in the back perfectly preserved, sitting upright, frozen into a single block of humanity. These were the ghosts that haunted the drivers. Every mile of the 30-mile crossing was a graveyard. It is estimated that for every 1,000 tons of food that reached the city, one driver lost his life. The bottom of Lake Ladoga is still littered with the rusted remains of the Polutorka trucks, their steering wheels still gripped by the skeletal hands of men who refused to let go. The shore of the lake at the Leningrad side, a place called Osinovets, became a landscape of surreal transition. There, the flour was unloaded onto sleds or the narrow-gauge railway. The smell of the raw flour was so overwhelming to the starving workers that they would sometimes faint. They would scrape the dust from the floor of the trucks with their fingernails, eating the raw, gritty powder just to feel something in their stomachs. Across the water, the lights of the German-held Schlisselburg flickered, a reminder of how close the enemy was and how thin the thread of survival had become. The road of life was also a corridor of psychological warfare. The Germans would broadcast over the radio that the ice had melted, or that the convoys had been annihilated. They wanted the people in the city to believe the lake was a barrier, not a bridge. But the sight of the bread, dark, heavy, and sawdust-filled as it was, proved them wrong. Every crumb of that bread had crossed the Lake of Ghosts. Every calorie had been paid for in the blood of a driver who had stared into the black water and kept his foot on the gas. As the winter of 1941 reached its deepest point, the ambient reality of Ladoga became one of crystalline, lethal beauty. The ice hummed with the vibration of thousands of tons of machinery. The anti-aircraft guns on the shore barked at the sky, their muzzles flashing like lightning against the white waste. And beneath it all, the silence of the deep. The lake was a cold mother, providing the path to life, while claiming the lives of the providers. Without the Lake of Ghosts, Leningrad would have been silenced by January 1942. The 125-gram ration would have dropped to 0, but the road held. Through the blizzards, through the Stuka raids, and through the shifting, groaning ice, the pulse of the city was maintained by a thin line of trucks crawling across a frozen sea. It was a miracle of the human spirit, but it was a miracle built on a foundation of tragedy. Join me in the next chapter as we return to the dark streets of the city to witness the biological collapse of the population. We will explore the shadow people, the study of dystrophy and the siege stare, where we look at what happens to the human mind when the body begins to consume itself and the line between the living and the dead becomes invisible. Chapter 8. The Shadow People. As we descend deeper into the winter of 1941, the atmosphere of Leningrad shifts from one of active struggle to a state of hollowed-out existence. This is the era of the shadow people. By December and January, the biological reality of the blockade had fundamentally altered the human form. The people of the city were no longer recognizable as the vibrant citizens who had walked the Nevsky Prospect just months prior. They had become biological remnants, their bodies engaged in a silent internal war, where every remaining cell was being taxed to stay alive. In the medical journals of the time, this was called alimentary dystrophy. In the streets, it was simply the process of becoming a ghost. To walk through Leningrad in January 1942 was to walk through a city of slow-motion horrors. The ambient quality of the streets was defined by a lack of momentum. Because the body's caloric intake was less than 20% of what was required for basic survival, the brain began to prioritize only the most essential movements. People walked with a peculiar, wide-based shuffle, their arms held slightly away from their bodies, as if they were made of glass. They did not turn their heads to look at passing shells. The energy required for a sudden movement was too expensive. They were shadows, moving through a landscape of white snow and black ruins, draped in layers of rags that hung loosely over frames that had lost 30, 40, or 50 pounds of mass. The physical transformation was grotesque. As the subcutaneous fat vanished, the skin lost its elasticity and turned a bruised, yellowish-grey, often covered in dark hunger spots. Because the body could no longer maintain its internal furnace, the extremities, fingers, toes, and noses were perpetually blue or black with frostbite. But the most haunting feature was the siege stare. The eyes did not sink. Rather, because the fat behind the sockets vanished, the eyes appeared to grow unnaturally large and luminous. They became fixed, glassy, and unblinking. When a shadow person looked at you, they weren't seeing a person. They were looking through you at a point on the horizon where food might exist. The psychology of dystrophy was even more profound than the physical decay. This is where the dark history of Leningrad reaches its most uncomfortable truths. Starvation is a thief of character. It strips away the higher functions of the brain: empathy, humor, curiosity, and morality, leaving only the raw, pulsing stem of the animal instinct. Survivors described a state of emotional anesthesia. You could see your own neighbor collapse in a snowdrift and feel nothing. You wouldn't stop to help, not because you were cruel, but because you knew that to bend down and lift them would cost you the calories you needed to reach the bread shop. To help was to die. The shadow people lived in a world where the heart had become as cold as the Siberian wind. This internal coldness extended to the home. In the communal apartments, the ambient sound was the silence of the nests. People would lie in their beds for 18 hours a day, huddled under every coat and rug they owned, moving only to fetch their 125 grams of bread. The social bonds that define humanity began to snap. Mothers would look at their children's rations with a momentary flickering thought of theft. Husbands and wives would count the crumbs on each other's plates. It was a state of constant, low-grade psychic agony. One diarist wrote, "We are no longer humans. We are simply stomachs, wrapped in skin, waiting for a piece of wood bread that never satisfies." Yet, within this shadow world, there were pockets of terrifyingly sharp lucidity. The shadow people developed a genius for survival. They learned how to make meat out of the glue from the backs of stamps. They learned that if you boiled a leather suitcase long enough, the tannins would leach out and leave a protein-rich jelly. They became chemists of the gutter, but this lucidity was often accompanied by starvation madness. People would hallucinate feasts. They would hear the sound of phantom bells or voices calling them into the snow. In the darkness of the blackout, the line between a dream and reality vanished. The ambient horror of the shadow people was most visible in the water journey we discussed earlier, but now it was populated by skeletons. You would see a man dragging a sled with a frozen body wrapped in a sheet. He would stop to rest, sitting on the corpse of his own wife because it was the only dry place to sit. He would stare at the sky, his breath a thin grey ghost, and then he would stand up and continue his shuffle. There was no weeping. The shadow people had no water left in their bodies for tears. Their tear ducts had dried up along with their muscles. The German soldiers, looking through their binoculars from the heights, saw these shuffling figures and were convinced they were looking at a dying race. They didn't understand that the shadow people were possessed by a stubbornness that defied biology. Even as their hearts were being consumed by their own bodies, The workers in the munitions factories, men and women who were so weak they had to be tied to their benches so they wouldn't fall over, continued to turn out shell casings. They were ghosts producing the steel that kept the living at the front. But the peak of the dystrophy winter in January 1942 brought the death toll to its absolute zenith. People were dying at a rate of 3,000 to 4,000 per day. The shadow people were becoming the silent people. The hallways of the apartment blocks were lined with bodies that no one had the strength to move. The stairwells became ice-coated chutes of death. The smell, the ambient scent of the city, was a mixture of wood smoke, ozone from the shells, and the faint, sweet, sickly odor of unburied bodies preserved by the cold. This chapter of the siege is a reminder that the greatest weapon of war isn't the bomb. It is the denial of the calorie. It is the systematic reduction of a human being to a shadow. Leningrad in the winter of 1941 was an experiment in the limits of the human soul, and as the shadow people shuffled through the darkness, they were carrying with them the secret of what happens when the world is stripped down to nothing but a metronome and a crust of bread. Join me in the next chapter as we enter the deepest, darkest corner of the blockade. We will confront the taboo, the moment when the hunger broke the final barrier of civilization, and the rise of the special squads to combat the horror that no one wanted to speak of, but everyone feared. Chapter 9. The Taboo. In every civilization, there is a final line. It is an invisible boundary built of morality, tradition, and the inherent sanctity of the human form. For centuries, we have lived with the comfort of knowing that no matter how dark the world becomes, there are certain things man does not do. But in Leningrad, by February 1942, the ambient descent into horror reached the point where that line did not just blur, it vanished into the frozen mud. This is the chapter of the blockade that remained hidden in Soviet archives for decades, suppressed by a government that wanted to project an image of heroic, stoic endurance. It is the history of the taboo. It is the history of cannibalism. To speak of this is not to sensationalize the suffering of the Leningraders, but to understand the absolute physiological catastrophe they were enduring. When the body reaches the final stages of dystrophy, when every gram of fat and muscle has been burned and the brain is swimming in a chemical soup of starvation-induced psychosis, the personality is erased. What remains is a biological machine screaming for fuel. In the dark, unheated corners of the city, the shadow people were forced to confront a reality that the modern mind can barely comprehend. The hunger had become a physical presence, a clawing beast inside the stomach that silenced the conscience and dismantled the soul piece by piece. By this point, even the sweet earth was gone, and the leather belts had been boiled to threads. The city was filled with the dead, thousands of bodies lying in hallways, in snowdrifts, and in the cold rooms of apartments. The ground was too frozen to dig, and the survivors were too weak to carry the dead to the cemeteries. To a mind fractured by hunger, the distinction between a person and protein began to dissolve. It began as a whisper, a terrifying rumor that drifted through the bread lines like a winter fever. People began to notice that some individuals in the city didn't have the siege stare. They looked unnaturally healthy, their faces flushed with a color that didn't belong in a starving city. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, began to notice a terrifying trend. Their daily reports, marked top secret, started to fill with a new category of crime. They divided the offenders into two chilling groups, trupojedstvo, which translates to corpse eating, and lyudojedstvo, which translates to person eating. The first group, the corpse eaters, were often people driven to the absolute brink, parents trying to save a remaining child, or individuals who had lost all sense of reality, scavenging from the frozen mounds of the dead left in the stairwells. The second group, the person eaters, were the true predators of the siege, those who lured the weak into dark alleys or apartments with the promise of food, only to commit the unthinkable. The ambient dread of the city took on a predatory edge. People no longer walked alone, even in the faint light of day. Mothers clutched their children with a terrifying intensity, not just because of the shells, but because of the gleaners. There were stories of human meat appearing on the black market, sold as veal or pork to unsuspecting desperate buyers who were so hungry they didn't ask questions. The authorities reacted with a swift, merciless violence. They formed special squads tasked specifically with patrolling the city for cannibals. There were no trials. If someone was found with human remains in their apartment, they were taken into the courtyard and shot immediately. Their ration cards were cancelled, and their names were erased from the rolls of the living. The records, finally declassified in the 1990s, show that over 2,000 people were arrested for cannibalism during the winter of 1941-1942. This number is small compared to the millions who suffered, but the psychological impact on the city was total. It was the ultimate eclipsed history, a shadow, that fell over the survivors and stayed there for the rest of their lives. To live through the siege was to know that your neighbor, your friend, or even your family might have looked at you and seen nothing but a way to survive another night. The communal trust that holds a society together had been incinerated in the fires of hunger. The ambient sound of this chapter is the sound of a door being bolted from the inside with 3 different locks. It is the heavy, suspicious silence that fell over a communal kitchen when a neighbor brought home a piece of meat that didn't look like any horse or dog anyone had seen. It was the way people avoided eye contact in the bread lines, afraid that their own weakness would mark them as a target. The city had become a forest of human predators and human prey. Every shadow in a doorway held a potential threat. Every invitation into a warm room was viewed with a cold, analytical suspicion. Even in this abyss, there were shades of human complexity. Most of those arrested for the act of scavenging from the dead were women, mothers who had watched their children turn into skeletons and had simply snapped, driven by a biological imperative to keep their offspring alive at any cost. The taboo was not a sign of inherent evil, but a symptom of a city that had been pushed beyond the biological limits of the human species. The darkness was not just the blackout, it was the collapse of the soul under the weight of 125 grams of sawdust bread. It was a tragedy of the most profound scale, where the victim and the perpetrator were often the same person. The German commanders, who intercepted some of these reports, used them as justification for their own cruelty. They used the reports of cannibalism to argue that the Russians were subhuman, reinforcing the Nazi ideology that the city deserved to be starved into extinction. They didn't see the irony that they were the ones who had created the laboratory for this horror. They were the ones who had tightened the noose until the human spirit snapped. They sat in their warm headquarters, documenting the degradation of a culture they were systematically destroying, using the results of their own crimes to justify further atrocities. As February turned into March, the taboo began to recede, not because the hunger had ended, but because the road of life was finally bringing enough flour to raise the rations, and the most desperate had already died. But the stain remained. For decades after the war, survivors would not talk about that winter. They would not talk about what they saw in the hallways or what they smelled in the communal kitchens. It was a secret buried under the hero city narrative, a dark, cold truth that remained eclipsed by the gold-leafed glory of the Soviet victory. To acknowledge the cannibalism was to acknowledge that the siege had won a victory over their souls. Leningrad in the winter of 1941 was an experiment in the limits of the human soul. It showed that under enough pressure, the very foundations of our humanity, the respect for the dead, the love for our neighbor, the sanctity of the body, can be crushed into dust. The city had become a graveyard of ethics. But even as the city reached this absolute nadir, a counterforce was rising. For while some surrendered to the animal instinct, others found a way to use the very tools of their culture, music, science, and art, to reclaim their humanity from the jaws of the blockade. They realized that if the body was to be consumed, the spirit had to be fed something more powerful than bread. The resilience of those who refused to cross the line is the true miracle of Leningrad. In the same buildings where some were committing unspeakable acts, others were writing poetry by the light of oil lamps, or sharing their last crumbs of bread with an orphaned child from the floor below. The taboo is a dark thread in the tapestry of the siege, but it is not the only thread. It serves as the shadow that gives depth to the light of the resistance that followed. It reminds us that civilization is a fragile thing, held together by the calories in our stomachs and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Join me in the next chapter as we witness a miracle in the midst of the carnage. We will see the Symphony of the Starving, the night that Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was broadcast to the world, performed by musicians so weak they had to be held up by their instruments, proving that the heart of Leningrad was still beating, even if its stomach was empty. We will watch as the music carries the city through the darkest night of its existence, reclaiming the airwaves from the ticking of the metronome and the screams of the hungry. Chapter 10. The Symphony of the Starving. The winter of 1941 had attempted to strip Leningrad of its humanity, reducing its people to biological shells and its streets to a graveyard of ethics. But as the spring of 1942 arrived, the city began to reclaim its soul through an act of defiance that was as loud as it was improbable. This is the story of the Seventh Symphony, composed by Dmitri Shostakovich. It is a moment in history where art ceased to be a luxury and became a weapon of war, a literal shield of sound intended to shatter the psychological noose the Germans had placed around the city. To understand the ambient deep dive of this chapter, you must imagine a city of skeletons attempting to play the most complex and demanding music ever written. In the summer of 1941, as the first bombs began to fall, Shostakovich had remained in the city, serving in a firefighting brigade. There is a famous photograph of him in his fireman's helmet, a scholar-turned-soldier sitting on the roof of the Leningrad Conservatory. It was amidst the smoke of the Badaev warehouses and the scream of the Stukas that he began to write his Leningrad Symphony. He was eventually evacuated to Samara, but the music he left behind, and the music he finished in exile, belonged to the stones of the city. The Soviet authorities decided that the symphony had to be performed in the heart of the blockade to prove to the world and to the Germans that Leningrad was not a corpse. The task of performing this masterpiece fell to the Leningrad Radio Orchestra. There was only one problem. The orchestra was dead, or rather, it was dying. When the conductor, Karl Eliasberg, called for the first rehearsal in March 1942, only 15 emaciated musicians showed up. The rest had either perished in the dystrophy winter, were too weak to walk, or were at the front lines. The first rehearsal lasted only 15 minutes because the brass players didn't have the breath to blow through their instruments, and the violinist's hands were shaking from the cold and hunger. Eliasberg himself was so weak he had to be brought to the hall on a sled. What followed was a mobilization of art unlike anything its world had ever seen. The military command issued an order. Any musician at the front was to be temporarily reassigned to the orchestra. Men were pulled from the trenches, their hands calloused from rifles, and told to pick up their oboes and cellos. They were given extra rations, hot soup, and an additional slice of bread, just to keep them from collapsing during rehearsals. Many of these musicians would play for an hour, then crawl into a corner to sleep, and too exhausted to move. 3 musicians died during the rehearsal period alone. Yet, they kept playing. The sound of the orchestra was thin at first, a ghostly echo in the massive, unheated hall of the Philharmonia. But as the weeks passed, the music grew limbs, it grew teeth. The performance was set for August 9th, 1942. This was the exact date Hitler had originally chosen for his victory banquet at the Hotel Astoria. To ensure the concert could proceed without being interrupted by German shells, the Soviet military launched Operation Squall. Every artillery battery in the Leningrad sector was ordered to unleash a massive, preemptive bombardment on the German positions an hour before the concert. They fired 3,000 shells to silence the enemy guns, creating a dome of silence over the city centre. Inside the grand hall of the Philharmonia, the scene was surreal. The chandeliers were lit for the first time in a year. The audience was made up of soldiers in uniform, factory workers in rags, and the surviving intelligentsia. They were all shadows, but they had dressed in their finest remaining clothes. When Eliasberg walked onto the podium, the audience stood in a silence so heavy it felt like it might break the floorboards. The musicians were so thin their formal suits hung off them like shrouds, but when the batons dropped, the music erupted. The Seventh Symphony is a massive 90-minute journey through the psychology of war. Its most famous section, the invasion theme, is a repetitive, mechanical march that builds from a tiny snare drum beat into a deafening, dissonant wall of sound. In the hall, people began to weep. It wasn't just music, it was a mirror. The music captured the sound of the panzers, the sound of the metronome, and the sound of the screams they had all kept bottled inside. It was a sensory exorcism. The symphony didn't shy away from the darkness of the taboo or the White Death. It acknowledged them, then drowned them in a triumphant C major finale that promised victory. The most incredible part of the night was the broadcast. The concert was played over every loudspeaker in the city and, most importantly, beamed via massive amplifiers toward the German trenches. The German soldiers, who had been told for months that Leningrad was a city of cannibals and corpses, suddenly heard a world-class orchestra playing a defiant, sophisticated symphony. It was a psychological masterstroke. Years later, German veterans would recount how they sat in their dugouts, listening to the music, and realized for the first time that they would never win the war. They realized that an army that could play a symphony while starving was an army that could never be conquered. The ambient experience of that night was one of transcendental defiance. For 90 minutes the hunger vanished, the cold vanished, the fear of the shadow people was replaced by the pride of the citizen. When the music ended, there was a silence that lasted for over a minute before the hall exploded into an ovation that lasted over an hour. It was the longest applause in the history of music, not because of the notes played, but because of the breath required to play them. The Symphony of the Starving proved that culture is not the icing on the cake of civilization. It is the flower. It is the thing that binds the human spirit together when everything else is stripped away. Shostakovich's Seventh did what the Soviet army could not yet do. It broke the psychological blockade. It told the world that Leningrad was still alive. It reclaimed the airwaves from the ticking of the metronome and replaced the sound of death with the sound of a living, breathing, screaming Russian soul. As the final notes faded into the summer air of 1942, the city knew that the worst was over. The 125 grams were gone, replaced by slightly larger rations. The road of life was becoming a permanent fixture, and while the siege would continue for another year and a half, the city of the living dead had officially rejoined the world of the living. The eclipsed history of the siege had found its voice, and it was a voice that would echo long after the German guns fell silent. Join me in the next chapter as we witness the violent, bloody climax of the blockade. We will see the Red Army launch Operation Iskra, the Spark. We will follow the soldiers as they charge across the frozen marshes to punch a hole in the steel noose, and we will see the high cost of the final breakthrough that would eventually set the city free. Chapter 11. Operation Iskra. By January 1943, Leningrad had endured 16 months of isolation. The Symphony of the Starving had provided a psychological victory, and the road of life had prevented total extinction, but the city remained a prisoner within the German steel noose. The front line had become a stagnant, frozen wound. To the south, the German 18th Army had spent over a year digging into the hills and marshes, creating a defense in depth so formidable they believed it was impregnable. They called this the Northern Wall, but the Soviet High Command, buoyed by the turning tide at Stalingrad, decided it was time to strike. They called the plan Operation Iskra, the Spark. The ambient atmosphere of this chapter is one of violent industrial kineticism. For over a year, the sound of Leningrad had been the ticking of the metronome and the quiet shuffle of the shadow people. Now that silence was to be shattered by the largest concentration of artillery the world had yet seen. The goal was to punch a hole through a narrow strip of land known as the bottleneck, an 8-mile-wide corridor between the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and the town of Muga. If the Red Army could seize this strip, they could build a rail line directly into the city. The bottleneck was a nightmare of geography. It was a land of peat bogs, dense forests, and the Siniavino Heights, a ridge that gave the German spotters a clear view of everything the Soviets were doing. To prepare for the assault, the Soviet soldiers practiced for weeks on life-sized replicas of the German trenches built in the rear. They knew that a standard infantry charge would be suicide. They had to be faster, more aggressive, and more desperate than the enemy. On the morning of January 12, 1943, the sky over Leningrad didn't turn blue. It turned a bruised, pulsating red. At 9:30 a.m., over 4,500 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire, simultaneously. This was not the rhythmic shelling the citizens were used to. This was a hurricane of steel. The vibration was so intense that it shattered the remaining windows in the city center, miles away from the front. The German trenches were smothered in a layer of fire and iron for 2 hours. One survivor recalled that the earth didn't just shake, it felt like it was liquidizing under their feet. When the barrage lifted, the Soviet infantry surged forward across the frozen Neva River. The ambient sound of the battle was a chaotic roar of Ura, the Russian battle cry, the clatter of PPSH submachine guns, and the roar of T-34 tanks painted in winter white. The ice on the Neva was so thick that the tanks could drive across it, but the German survivors of the shelling fought back with a suicidal tenacity. They had spent a year turning every basement, every peat-digging machine, and every ridge into a fortress. The fighting was savage and intimate. In the peat bogs, the snow was stained a dark, oily crimson. Because the ground was a maze of trenches and dugouts, much of the combat was hand-to-hand. Bayonets, grenades, and even entrenching shovels used in the dark, frozen mud. The ambient quality of Operation Iskra was one of sensory overload, the smell of cordite, the metallic tang of blood in the freezing air, and the blinding flashes of the Katyusha rocket launchers, which the Germans called Stalin's organs, because of the terrifying whistling sound they made. For 6 days, the two sides tore at each other in the bottleneck. The Soviet troops attacking from inside the city, the Leningrad front, fought toward their comrades attacking from the outside, the Volkhov front. They were like two drowning men reaching for each other through a wall of fire. On January 18, 1943, at 9:30 in the morning, the two fronts finally met near settlement number 5. The scene of the link-up is one of the most emotional moments in the history of the war. Soldiers who had been separated from the world for 500 days fell into each other's arms, weeping and laughing. They didn't look like an army, they looked like survivors of a shipwreck. They were hollow-cheeked and ragged, but they had done the impossible. They had cracked the steel noose. In Leningrad, the news was broadcast over the radio. The metronome stopped. The announcer's voice broke as he told the city that the blockade had been breached. People who hadn't had the strength to walk for months poured into the streets. They hugged strangers. They danced in the snow. The ambient sound of the city changed in an instant, from a funeral dirge to a riot of joy. However, the spark was only a partial victory. The corridor they had opened was only 5 to 8 miles wide, well within range of German heavy artillery. The Germans still held the Siniavino Heights, looking down on the narrow strip of land, but the Soviet engineers didn't care. Within 17 days of the breakthrough, they had built a 30-kilometer railway through the marshes and over the frozen river. They called it the Victory Railway, but the crews who ran the trains called it the Corridor of Death. The trains had to run at night without lights, while German shells rained down on the tracks. Every morning, repair crews would go out into the freezing wind to replace twisted rails and fill craters so the next train could pass. But the trains kept coming. They brought real flour, real meat, and most importantly, they brought hope. For the first time since September 1941, the people of Leningrad were no longer living in a cage. Operation Iskra didn't end the siege. The Germans would remain at the gates for another year, but it proved that the northern wall could be broken. It was the moment the city of the living dead reclaimed its physical connection to the world. The shadow of the taboo and the White Death was finally retreating. The eclipsed history of the blockade was moving toward its final bittersweet conclusion. Join me in the final chapter as we witness the total liberation of the city and the aftermath of the 900 days. We will tally the cost of the survival, look at the empty apartments that remained as monuments to the dead, and reflect on the legacy of the city that forgot how to smile, but never forgot how to endure. Chapter 12. The City That Forgot to Smile. The final collapse of the steel noose did not come with a whisper, but with a roar that leveled the horizon. On January 27, 1944, a full year after the narrow corridor of Operation Iskra had been opened, the Soviet military launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. This was no longer a desperate scramble for survival. It was a juggernaut. Hundreds of thousands of fresh troops, backed by a localized industrial machine that had been forged in the fires of the blockade, surged forward. They didn't just push the Germans back, they shattered the 18th Army and sent the EE master race into a panicked, chaotic retreat toward the Baltic. For the first time in 872 days, the German heavy artillery fell silent. The ambient experience of that final evening was one of sensory overload. At 8 p.m., the sky over the Neva River was illuminated by 324 guns, firing 24 salvos. It was a victory salute, the first of its kind, but as the colored flares and shells lit up the scarred facades of the Winter Palace and the shattered windows of the Hermitage, the people of Leningrad did not react with the rowdy, champagne-soaked jubilation seen in London or Paris. They stood in the streets in a heavy communal silence. They looked at the lights in the sky with eyes that had seen the White Death and the Shadow People. They were alive, but they were not the same people who had seen the sun set on June 22, 1941. Leningrad had become a city that forgot how to smile. The trauma of the 900 days had etched itself into the very limestone of the buildings. As the blackout was lifted and the streetlights flickered back to life, they revealed a landscape of ghosts. There were thousands of apartments where the doors remained bolted from the inside, rooms where entire families had drifted into the White Death together, their bodies preserved by the cold, waiting for a spring that arrived too late. The ambient scent of the city shifted from wood smoke to the dust of reconstruction, but underneath it remained the metallic tang of the siege. The cost of the survival was a number that defies human comprehension. While official Soviet figures once claimed 600,000 deaths, modern historians estimate that between 1.1 and 1.5 million people perished. Most did not die from shells or bullets. They died from the slow, agonizing erosion of hunger. If you were to hold a minute of silence for every victim of the Leningrad blockade, the city would remain silent for over 2 years. The aftermath was a period of eclipsed mourning. The Soviet government, eager to promote the narrative of the hero city, discouraged the survivors from talking about the taboo or the sheer scale of the incompetence that had led to the initial encirclement. They wanted a story of steel and fire, not a story of boiled leather and sweet earth, but the people knew. They carried the siege stare in their hearts. For decades, survivors would keep a stash of dried bread, sukari, under their pillows or in their cupboards, a psychological insurance policy against a world they no longer trusted to keep them fed. The legacy of Leningrad is not found in the gold stars or the monuments, but in the silence of the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery. There, across miles of grassy mounds, lie the hundreds of thousands who were buried in mass graves. There is no individual names on the mounds, only years: 1941, 1942, 1943. It is the largest graveyard in the world, a silent testament to the price of endurance. When you walk there, the only sound is the wind and the faint recorded music of the Seventh Symphony, playing from hidden speakers, a permanent sound of the heartbeat for those who no longer have one. Leningrad proved that the human spirit is a terrifyingly resilient thing. It showed that we can endure the unendurable, that we can find music in the midst of starvation, and that we can remain human even when the world treats us as biological waste. But it also showed us the darkness of the frozen noose, the way civilization can be stripped away until only the most jagged, raw edges of existence remain. The city survived, but the 900 days left a scar on the Russian soul that has never truly faded. As the sun rose over a free Leningrad in the spring of 1944, the white nights returned. The sky turned that familiar pearlescent violet. The Neva flowed freely, no longer clogged with the sludge ice of the water journey. The city was beautiful again, but it was a haunted beauty. It was a city that had looked into the abyss and refused to blink, but in doing so, it had seen things that no living soul should ever have to witness. Outro. The siege of Leningrad remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern warfare, a 900-day descent into a cold that froze the heart and a hunger that consumed the soul. It is a reminder of the fragility of our world and the incredible, often terrifying, strength of those pushed to the brink. Thank you for joining me on this ambient deep dive into the city of the living dead. This was a long journey, and if you have stayed with me until the very end, I truly appreciate your time and your curiosity. History is not just a collection of dates, it is the lived experience of those who came before us, and by remembering their stories, we ensure that their shadows never truly vanish. If this exploration of the Leningrad blockade moved you, please consider hitting the like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story resonated with you the most? Was it the sound of the metronome, the ritual of the 125 grams, or the defiance of the 7th Symphony? I read every comment, and I value the community we are building here. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the eclipsed corners of our past. Until then, keep seeking the truth in the shadows. Stay safe, stay curious, and I will see you in the next chapter.